Okay, so we are on class number 2, which is really excited. The last class we went over just an overview of where we're going to put our garden, some qualifications that will be good for whatever location that we are picking. For today's class, we're going to go over the growing style, essentially how we are going to grow the crops based on the location that we picked. We have the growing style of, we can grow them in ground, just straight in ground. If you have a decent to moderately decent soil, we'll go into that for in-ground gardening. And then we also have a raised bed gardening as well as container gardening. So those are three different ways that you could grow your crops. It doesn't have to be either one. It could also be a combination of all of them, which is what I do. So the preference is based on, maybe you have a location that you want to grow, but you don't have access to soil. So maybe you have a deck space that you want to grow something. This would be good for your container gardening. Hi, everyone that's just joining us. This would be good for your container gardening. So, or maybe you have just a paved space. That would also be good to just add some containers. Or maybe you're just starting out and you don't want to invest a lot of money into, seeing if this is something that you're going to continue doing or sparks a lot of interest for you. So maybe, pick out a little space in ground, take off some of the grass, and you plant right in ground. But I'm going to go through some of the pros and cons of each one of these options. Just in general, different containers or different raised bed choices that you can make. So firstly, let's go into in-ground one because that is essentially could be the cheapest option for you. Just with anything though, it could start out really cheap and then it could get expensive based on the adjustments that you're trying to make. But there's a lot of people coming in now. Let me first introduce myself. I always forget to do that. I'm just like into the gardening. But hi, everyone that's coming in. My name is Ti, and I'm from IrieGardener. And today's class, as I was telling everyone, is going to be on the growing styles. This class was sponsored by Better Spaces. Thank you for doing that. And they were able to put this together so that you guys can enjoy a free live show. So you'll be able to ask questions towards the end. But if something is, at the top of your mind and you're not able to remember it to the end, feel free to leave it down in the chat. At the end, I'm going to try and see if anyone has questions, and you could go ahead and type out the questions, or you could raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you could ask your question verbally. So let's get back into it. So we're talking about in-ground gardening, and I was saying that this could be the cheapest option based on how you do it. So this will be what you'll see a lot of, maybe small gardening companies or growers. They'll have the in-ground where they'll have a bed that's about 2 feet wide, and then they'll have a pathway that they may have used with, may have put like hay in the pathway to kind of suppress the weeds. You will see that this is more labor intensive on the body though, because you are quite low to the ground, but it is really good for your pockets. So if you have, like myself, I have clay soil. So if you have something like clay soil, what you could do is just add some amendments. So amendments could be things like manure, like cow, horse, chicken manure. That will add good fertility in the soil. So that would feed the soil as well as whatever plants you're putting in that space. Or you could also add something like compost, either compost that you make yourself at home or compost that you buy in the bag at store, or maybe from some landscaping company, you could find some good compost. So amending it would be to add something that adds fertility or in the case of a clay soil, I would add also some sand, and that will aerate the clay soil. If anybody here has dealt with clay soil, you know that it's very compacting. It could be restricting on the roots. So you want to add something like sand that will make it a lot lighter and easier for the roots to spread out. It's fine usually for more established trees or big things like that, but when you're growing vegetables and stuff, you really need to add that aeration to your clay soil. Versus if you have a more sandy soil, you may want to add some topsoil or something heavier to then just even that out. Then after you have your amendments, you could then go ahead and just plant right in there. So if you are just starting out and you don't know which way you want to go, you don't want to spend too much money, I would highly recommend trying just picking a little space in ground if you have that access and adding, like I said, you could use the black cow, some sand, aerate that soil if you have the clay, vice versa if you have a sandy soil, and just use that space to experiment and see, if you like growing, and then I guess expand from there. Like I said, the downside with in-ground planting is that it could be really hard on the body. You have to be very low. You have to, deal with a lot of weeds. It's not very good with weed suppression. Also, when it comes to pests like your bunnies, your groundhogs, I mean, they have a feast right there. So if you're dealing with that, maybe add a little fence around it. I'm not sure. But being lower to the ground means that there'll be more pests and stuff that will get access to your veggies. Another method when you're doing in ground, I don't know if you guys know Charles Dowding. He has a method called the no dig method, and this is where you'd put cardboard. You don't want to use cardboard that has dye. So let's say, for example, if we order pizza and that's cardboard, but at the top portion they usually have the design for the company. Sometimes it's white. All that color could essentially just leach into your soil. So you want to pick cardboard that has minimal to no type of writing on the cardboard, and you'll lay that down, and then you'll just add compost on top. I believe it's about 2 feet of compost. So that can get expensive based on if you are bringing in compost or if you have the compost already that you've been making on your own. So with everything, it just all depends on how you go about getting those different materials and sourcing different things. With cardboard, you could get it from the packages that we all get in the mail, or you could source it from maybe like a store that just chucks their cardboard. So with anything, you can make it cheaper. It's just about the ease of doing things. Sometimes the cheaper you have to put in more work versus if you want to be a little bit more hands off, you're going to have to put a little bit more money up front. So that's a method of doing in-ground gardening, and that's also really good if you have maybe just really bad soil, like you cannot work with it at all, or it's very compact. You could use the no dig method to grow your veggies. So with the in-ground, the other downside is usually when it starts warming up, we're going through spring. I know for my area, it's really rainy. What happens when it's really rainy is that soil really holds on to that moisture. So you're going to have to wait like mid May, April for that soil to really dry out well enough in order for you to plant in ground. So in ground takes a month or so away from your growing time. So that is something to also consider. Let me know if you guys have any questions for that one. Okay, we are going to move on to the raised bed. I personally prefer using the raised bed. If you have any mobility issues, you can adjust raised beds to be a more comfortable height for you. You could make raised beds out of a lot of different things. Personally, my raised beds are made out of bricks. They were completely free. We went on Marketplace and just loaded up my car, and we, little bit at a time, kept building more and more beds. But like I say, you could go and buy bricks, and that would be a little bit more expensive. But I found it for free. You could also make your beds out of natural materials like grapevines or willow tree. Those are really nice to look at and also free if you have the trees around to harvest those branches and make your raised beds. You could make them obviously out of wood. There's different types of wood. Some are more rot resistant than other. The top two for woods would be your redwood and your cedar wood. But you could also make them out of fence posts. You could make them out of pine. I know it's more frowned upon, but I did initially make my beds out of pressure treated wood. You guys could do your own research about that, but I did go ahead and use pressure treated wood for my first initial beds. And then, there's bricks, not bricks, cement blocks. You could use that to make your bed. So, get creative. If you don't have a big budget, go ahead and look around and see what you could use. Maybe something that you could pick up from somewhere that you could get for free versus having to pay and have new things come in. It's also really about like aesthetics. Like maybe the free things doesn't look as good as you want it to be. So you may have to fork over that money to get what you really want if you're for the aesthetic garden. I'm kind of in that aesthetic garden area, which is why I, picked the brick, but I was able to find a little wiggle room and pick up some for free, which is nice. You can also use what do you call it? Okay, so I started gardening during the pandemic, and during that time there was a lot of things that you couldn't get, and we didn't want to go to the store and possibly get something. So we started to look around, and we had some beans that we didn't want in the area that it was, so we decided to use those beans for my raised bed. So get creative. I've seen where people use trees that have been chopped down, and they use that to create a bed. They lined it with weed fabric, and that was a garden bed. So it could be as cheap or as expensive as you want it to be. So the upside of the raised beds is that you're able to plant in that so much quicker. Why? Because it's off the ground and elevated, it's not sitting in any of that moisture that comes in the early spring. So you're able to go ahead and plant those nice spring vegetables like your broccoli, your cauliflower, your peas, all that thing, because when it's raised up a bit off the ground, you are getting that good drainage. So whatever is coming down from the rain, soon enough that dissipates into the soil below, and you're able to still plant in a raised bed. I did note that whenever you're doing your raised beds, I think you should try to keep it around 3 feet wide. I know it says like 4 feet, but usually that's a little bit harder to reach the entire distance of the bed in order to weed or whatever you have to do. Sometimes if you go that 4 feet, you'd have to walk around. So just kind of think of anything that makes it easier on yourself. The other thing about raised beds is that you don't have to deal with weeds as much, right? So when you're closer to the ground, you have different things that the birds may have dropped, or maybe you already have some weeds that are coming up and are an issue. You're able to essentially dodge that by building up and doing your gardening in the raised bed. So that's a upside of that. Speaking of pests and, well, speaking of critters, if you build it a little bit higher, it'll be harder for the bunnies to get in. Um, Nothing really prevents the squirrels. They are like, they get to anything, but the bunnies, if you have a high enough raised beds, they're not able to get in, as well as you may be able to prevent the groundhogs depending on if they feel like digging under or not. But that is a upside of the raised bed. Another thing with the raised bed is you can essentially customize your soil, right? So different plants need different depths, but they also need different types of soil. So you'll have things that need more alkaline soil, things that need more acidic soil, or things that just want a neutral soil, as well as you may have crops like root vegetables that needs a more aerated soil. So in my garden, I have about 3 beds that I use for specifically root vegetables, and these vegetables need, like I said, a more aerated soil. So it's very sandy, it's very loomy, and that allows those crops to grow really well. This would be great if you have a bunch of blueberry plants that you want to keep in one raised bed, because blueberry needs a more acidic soil. So you can essentially plant all your blueberries in one raised bed, adjust the soil so it's all acidic, and then you'll have some blueberries that just loves the area that they're planted in, versus having to kind of adjust and amend the different locations of the blueberry plants. Have them in one place, have the soil be exactly how they want it, and then you're good to go. So that is another upside of the raised bed. But with anything, there's a little bit of downside. And the downside of the raised bed is that sometimes you have to, sorry, 1 second. Okay, so we have a question for Karen. Do you put cardboard or anything down in your raised beds before putting in dirt? Okay, so you can put cardboard down. You can also put hardware cloth down if you have like a critter issue that could help with the groundhogs digging and stuff. For me personally, I like my clay soil. So I skimmed off the grass and I dug into that clay soil and I amended it, because there's just so many good microbes and stuff in that soil. So I didn't want to completely block it off. So the cardboard is also good. I could have placed cardboard down and put soil on top of that. But if I dig into the clay soil, that gives me about maybe 6 inches of soil that I then don't have to bring into and purchase to grow my veggies. So that was kind of my thought process of using the clay soil and incorporating it with my. I used the black cow and I used the sand to amend it. So I worked with the soil that was already in my yard. But if you aren't completely sure about how good your soil could be, you could then put down wheat fabric, or you could put down cardboard. Just know that that cardboard over time it will deteriorate. So sometimes all the grass don't get killed depending on how aggressive that grass is. If you're putting it in a grassy area, sometimes it doesn't get killed and it comes back through. So like I said, if you can, just go ahead and skim off that grass and go ahead and plant from there. So, as far as the raised beds, I was going over the downside of that. And the downside is that sometimes it's just a little bit out of budget. Like you're not able to do that at the moment. And that brings me into something like container gardening, where it's a little bit cheaper to purchase the smaller containers and just start with that versus trying to build out a large raised bed. And containers work really well for things like that, where you have a contaminated soil, or you have maybe a paved area and you're not able to remove that pavement to get to the ground soil. You could then add different containers. There's vertical containers, there's almost looks like planter raised beds that you'll put out in ground. but they're on legs, and you could put those on your decks or on a paved patio area, and that will allow you to go ahead and plant and start something. With container gardening, something that you really want to consider, firstly, which is the same thing when you're planning out your raised bed garden, is watch out for how the sun is working in that area. Make sure that wherever you put your container and whatever plant is in that container, that you're putting it in a area that has the correct sun requirement. So firstly, when you are doing your containers, think about what you really want to plant, and then do a little research about how much sunlight that plant needs, right? There's some things that just needs maybe 5 to 6 hours. You have your leafy greens that could do well in just 4 hours, but then anything that is bearing fruit, you'd want to make sure that you are, sorry, you want to make sure that you are giving it 6 to 8 hours or much sunlight as you possibly can. You can start out with your plastic containers or your grow bags. You could also use recyclable things like, let's say you have a jug. We do the jug for the winter sowing, but if that's all you have, you can grow some things in that as well. Just be mindful of the depth. 1 second. Okay, so another question. Can you recommend a website that gives accurate information regarding how deep your dirt should be in containers or raised beds, depending on vegetable? Also, would it supply what kind of, okay. Also, would it supply what kind of soil is best depending on each vegetable? Okay, so I don't have a specific website, unfortunately. But if you just do a search, it will come up based on whatever you're planting. When it comes to containers, we're going to touch on that, is you need to use potting soil. If you're just starting out, I wouldn't recommend going out in your yard and getting the dirt from in your yard and putting it in the container, because that dirt may not be quite the right conditions. Maybe clay and it will be too compact, or it's sandy and it's too loose, right? If you've been gardening for a while, you can do that. I've done that and I've amended it to work for the container. But if you are just starting out, I would recommend you use potting soil. Some of my favorites are Vigaro potting soil. And I also really like, I just started trying this, is the Coast of Maine potting soil. And something to also consider, if let's say you are in a colder zone and you want to grow something, but then also bring it inside, it's good to use potting soil, because guess what? You're not bringing it inside. You're not bringing all those worms or little microbes, little centipedes, all that stuff. If you bring that soil that you just amended and take that inside, they're going to be crawling out in your living room or wherever you put that pot. So also consider that if you are using containers and then want to bring them inside, is think about, what else are you going to be bringing inside with those containers? So I would say if you're just starting out, just go ahead and use those potting soil. So those I really highly recommend. Can potting soil be used for most vegetables? Yeah, potting soil can be used for most vegetables. What's good about potting soil is that they have nutrients already added in that potting mix, and that usually feeds your plants for about 3 months. If you plan to have something in there for longer than that, you can go ahead and add granular fertilizer. The good side of granular fertilizer is that because it's granular, it will feed your plant over time as you water it. But anything that's in a pot, like when it rains or anything, as you water it, all that nutrients is slowly coming out, right? So it's not going to last forever. So you will have to maybe top up your container with granular fertilizer, maybe at the 3 month mark. That way your plant could get that continuous feed. If you don't have granular fertilizer, Also, I should know granular fertilizer, it's not an instant thing, right? So if you feed that, like I said, it's over time. Whereas the liquid fertilizer, and my favorite liquid fertilizer is just anything organic. I like gosh, the Alaska fish fertilizer. They have one that, if you look at the back, you'll have the NP and K. The I believe the NP and K is 511, which is good for your more leafy greens. So the 5 being on the nitrogen, that's what it's going to be feeding. You're going to have that nice green leaves. I'll touch on fertilizer in maybe a couple more classes from this, but then they have one for the fruiting part, and I believe the NPK on that is like 110 or something of that nature. But you can also use liquid fertilizer. And the good thing about liquid fertilizer is as soon as you water that in, that plant is able to take that in instantly. So if you're seeing something that's really suffering in that moment, go ahead and use a liquid fertilizer, and that way they get that nourishment right away. And then you could still go ahead and add your granular so that after you stop using the liquid, or if you forget, the granular fertilizer would feed it and maintain that good green growth. So that's something that you should note about container gardening. If you are on a deck, you want to make sure that you are thinking about how, like the size capacity, the weight that it could hold, not the size, the weight that it could hold. You don't want to put too much things on your deck, and then, with all that soil and stuff, it weighs it down, and God forbid it collapses. But you just want to be mindful of that. You can grow a bunch of stuff in different containers. So, like I say, think about the different plants that you're trying to grow. You could even do flowers. Think about the sun exposure that they need and adjust based on that. And another thing that makes it a lot easier, if you're able to add wheels to your containers, that will make things so much easier for you in order to move them around. Let's say, for example, you want to have a plant that needs full sun, but you want to maybe keep them over in the shade for a bit. You're able to have more control of where and when your plants is getting that sunlight. So if you are able to add that wheel, that will be really helpful for you. Um, let's see. And then for the containers, you can do something that is vertical. I have a lot of vertical containers from Greenstock. I highly recommend them. They have, it's called tiers, and they have like 5 and 7 tiers where their pockets are 10 and 7 inches deep. So you get a wide range of things that you could plant in those. It takes up very little space, and I believe you'll get like 30 to 35 different planting spaces that you could plant in. So that's really amazing. If you also have just containers that you have on the ground, you could add things like trellises to help for the plants that are needing that support and things like that. That way, you're able to maximize your space. Again, if you add anything that's vertical, that will clear up space at the bottom that you could even, let's say you have a tomato in the planter, right? And you stake it up vertically, that bottom portion now is left open, and you could add some marigolds, which is good for pest prevention. So I'm already talking too much. We have a couple minutes. If you guys have any questions, you could type them in the chat, or you could just do a hand and I could unmute you and you could ask your question that way as well. So I'm just going to give a few minutes to anyone that wants to ask anything. Okay, so I'm not seeing anything. Or maybe you guys are typing. I just want to make sure I'm not skipping anything, because last class, I was just about to end and then I heard someone wanting to say something.
Yeah, I have a question. Do you
Oh,
um in growing basil on the deck?
Right.
Do you have any tips in terms of um, how to properly care for it, and when's a good time, to pick the leaves, and how much, and do you have to top them or head them, deadhead them?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, pests, but we don't want to use pesticides of any kind.
Right.
Do you have any suggestions?
Okay, so basils is one of those things that just really wants to grow. You don't really have to do much for the basil. I highly recommend the Genovese and the holy basil, which is a basil that has this really nice fragrance and it's really good in drinks. What I would say is if you are doing it by seed or if you're just purchasing it, the deadheading, I would think of it as just making sure you're using it as much as possible, right? So even if, let's say, for example, your basil is getting really big,
Yeah, it gets tall. Yeah, it gets
yeah,
gets stemmy. Yeah,
right,
yeah.
right. So you want to go in and maybe about 2 inches or so from the base of the plant. Try to check to make sure that there's still leaf before you cut it, right? Because you
Hmm.
could go really low, but keep some leaves there because that leaf then will be doing the photosynthesis, which will
Right.
then regenerate for more to come. So you could go really low, just make
Ah,
sure that wherever you're cutting it, it still has some leaf so that it could push back out. So
with the
once you do
yeah
that, hmm?
with the leaf, like you're saying, like you can go down pretty low. Yeah, which is we haven't gone low enough. I'm thinking,
No,
but
you haven't.
should the leaf be on the stems that you're cutting? In other words, there little small leaves that are starting to
Mhm.
sort of bud down low.
Yes, yes.
Aha.
So you'll see two little small leaves, and they're kind of small because the rest of the basil is kind of shading it out. So
Yeah,
it's not
exactly. Yeah,
getting
yeah.
right.
It's like a
So
canopy. Yeah.
right. So once you cut that, then that is like, oh, I'm the main show. It's time
Aha.
to put out and show out, and you'll start putting out more and just continue harvesting your basil, and that is the best thing that you could do for it. And then
Okay.
if you see that it's starting to create seeds at the
Yeah.
top, pick that out. Pick
Get the
that
seeds
out.
out.
Yeah, pick
Okay.
those seeds out.
Yeah.
Go as low to the bottom where you still see leaves
Hmm.
and harvest it, blend it with some olive oil, put it in some ice cubes and,
Mm-hmm.
throw it
Mm-hmm.
in some dishes. But yeah, you just want to keep harvesting that basil
Yeah,
and
I think we're
eat it.
we're too we're not harvesting it enough,
Hmm.
and like you said, we're not when we trim it, we're
Hmm.
only going maybe a couple inches instead of like, and it gets really
Yeah.
leggy. It gets
Hmm.
8, 10, 12 inches.
Yeah.
It's like it turns into like almost like a vine, so to speak. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
It will
It's
just keep
it just
going.
yeah, it goes
Yeah.
nuts. So really
Yeah.
cut it down, and so let it keep recycling, I guess.
Hmm. And then if you maybe want to add more, whatever you cut, you
Hmm.
could just stick it in the ground, honestly, or you could put it in some water and then
Hmm.
bring it over to somewhere else and you have another basil plant. They
Would it
really
root?
just want to grow.
Would it root in water? Would it
Yeah.
root in?
They're
It
root
would
in
root.
water.
It'll root in water.
Hmm.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's pretty hardy,
Yeah,
and
pretty hardy. Not much things bother it because of the fragrance.
the fragrance.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have. I don't know if they're like gnats or something, but sometimes they're oddly attracted to it. Occasionally, we've noticed, or maybe because there's other plants nearby, and they're just kind of
Yeah, or it's
paying a visit.
what I noticed with the gnats, it could be your soil.
Aha.
Yeah, if your soil is too compact and you added something like a dense um, amendment, like
Mm-hmm.
let's say black cow, for example, that
Mm-hmm.
denseness is a breeding ground for gnats. So that
Aha.
could be what's bringing those gnats to you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you for your question. Let's see. Jade said, I'm putting a butterfly or meadow in my flower bed. Any good tips for keeping weeds down? I would say if you have any grass or anything like that, take that out initially. Go ahead and put cardboard. I'm a big component of cardboard. It does work. But if you have if you've used that and you're still having issues, then go ahead and use that weed fabric. I do use it. it's an issue with like things leaching, plastic leaching into your soil, but sometimes that's your only option. If you go on my channel, I do recommend a very good weed fabric that really keeps those weeds down. I have bindweed and I just have to use weed fabric. The cardboard doesn't work, unfortunately. Then Mark says, for 5 or 10 gallon buckets, would you drill holes in the bottom or sides to allow for drainage? And if on the sides, how high from the bottom? Okay, good question. So, before I get into that though, let me just quick side note. Based on whatever you're planting in your container, there are resources that tells you how big your container should be in order to be sufficient enough for that plant to grow. So that's something that you should also check out. Yes, I would definitely drill holes in the bottom if there's not already bottoms. You do not have to drill holes at the sides, but if you are going to do that, you can go about an inch or two up. The more drainage, the better, especially if you are putting it on a maybe hard surface, then I will go ahead and do some side drainage as well. Nan says, what is best to line wicker basket, plastic or burlap or something else? I actually have quite the experience with this. So I have some wicker baskets, and the thing with containers is when it's smaller, they tend to dry out a lot quicker, right? So usually they'll give you the basket and they'll line it with like burlap already. That's gonna dry out really quickly. So what I would do is put some plastic in that basket and then create some drainage holes and then go ahead and put your soil and plant whatever you're planting. Because if you do not do that, you're going to be watering that thing almost every hour on the hour in the very heat of summer. So that's what I would recommend. Any more questions? You're welcome. Any more questions before I head out? Okay, so thank you guys so much for joining me for this class. Make sure that you are following Better Spaces so that you could get notified for the other class. I have a lot of class coming up. The next one will actually be on Earth Day, and we're going to be speaking about soil and amendments and all of that good stuff. We're going to make it fun. Soil is kind of, but we're going to make it fun. So thank you guys, and I hope that you have an amazing rest of your day. Bye.